The wind carried the sound of wheels over the red plains like a song meant for someone who'd stopped listening long ago. Dusk bled across the sky as the stagecoach rattled toward Red Hollow, its wheels churning dust and regret. Inside, a young woman sat upright, her gloved hands wrapped around a single letter, the paper soft and creased from too much holding. Clara Whitfield, 28, had crossed 3 states for this letter's promise. Each word had once sounded like salvation. Now, as the coach slowed, it trembled in her grasp like a lie that had waited too long to be told. The stage stopped beside the weathered sign that read, Red Hollow, population 112. She stepped down, her boots sinking into the dust. Eyes turned. A few townsfolk paused mid-conversation, measuring her with quiet curiosity, maybe pity. A gray-haired woman approached, Ruth Tanner, the boarding-house widow, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you, miss?" Ruth asked kindly. Clara swallowed hard. "I'm here for Mr. Eli Mercer. I'm his bride." A hush spread across the platform. Even the horses seemed to still. Ruth's face softened into something that wasn't quite surprise, but sorrow. "Oh, honey, you best come inside." Clara frowned, clutching her letter tighter. "Is he not here?" Ruth hesitated, then said quietly, "Eli's bride died last night. Took sick on her way from Abilene. Fever, they said. He buried her this morning." For a moment, the world tilted. The air felt too thin to breathe. Clara blinked at her own reflection in the window pane of the general store, a stranger staring back. "No," she whispered. "There must be a mistake. I'm her." But there was no mistake. She had come a day too late. Ruth guided her inside the boarding house, ignoring the low murmur of voices behind them. At the supper table, steam rose from a pot of stew, but Clara couldn't eat. Her eyes traced the wooden grain, the worn plates, the shadows of people who had gathered and gone. The sound of laughter from the saloon down the road carried faintly through the window, a cruel reminder that life went on, even when hearts did not. Ruth poured her tea and spoke gently. "You rest here tonight. Tomorrow I'll help you find your way." Clara nodded numbly. Upstairs, she sat on the narrow bed, unbuttoned her gloves, and laid the letter on her lap. Its ink was faded, but the words burned clear. "I'll be waiting at Red Hollow. I'm a man of few words, but I'll give you an honest life." A broken laugh escaped her throat. "Honest life?" she whispered to the empty room. "And I couldn't even be honest with time." Outside, rain began to fall, slow, heavy drops against the roof. She pressed her forehead to the glass, staring into the wet dark. In her mind, she saw her mother's tired face, her sister's hungry eyes. This marriage had been her one escape. Now even that was gone. By morning, the rain had turned the streets to mud. Clara stood at the boarding-house porch when a horse approached, a tall, dark gelding carrying a broad-shouldered man in a dust-stained coat. His hat brim shadowed his face, but his presence was quiet and unyielding, like the earth itself. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked softly. He dismounted, glanced at her once, just long enough for her to see the grief carved deep into his features, then nodded. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know—" He cut her off gently. "No need for apologies." He turned as if to leave. "Please," she blurted. "I'd like to help. With the burial. I owe that much." He paused. For a long moment, he said nothing. The sound of the rain filled the space between them. Then he nodded once. "If you mean it, come along." They rode in silence through the soaked fields to the small patch of land behind his ranch. A pine box rested beneath a cottonwood tree covered by a plain white cloth. There was no preacher, no hymns, just wind and the smell of wet earth. Eli took the shovel, but Clara reached for one too. "Please," she said, "let me." He hesitated, then handed it over. Together they worked in silence, the dull thud of soil marking the rhythm of loss. Her dress darkened with mud. Her gloves tore. After a while, she said quietly, "In Missouri, I used to teach children to plant flowers after loss. Said roots remember what hearts forget." He looked at her, not with pity, but curiosity, maybe understanding. "Then plant something," he said. She knelt by the grave, pressing a few sprigs of wild sage into the damp earth. Her fingers trembled, yet there was peace in the motion, and as if she were sewing a prayer. Eli watched, his hands resting on the shovel, his hat dripping rain. When it was done, they stood side by side, neither knowing what to say. The silence between them wasn't empty this time. It was full of something unspoken, fragile, real. Back at the ranch, Eli wiped the mud from his boots. "You've come a long way for nothing," he said at last. "But I could use a cook. If you're looking to stay a while—" Clara hesitated. The firelight flickered across his face, half in shadow, half in weary kindness. "I'll stay," she said quietly. That night, as she lit the lantern in the Mercer house, its warm glow spilled into the dark corners. She stood there a long while, watching the flame tremble. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled away into silence. A woman meant to marry had buried instead. But in the hush between what was meant and what remained, something else, quiet and alive, began to breathe. Morning came soft and gold, spilling over the hills like forgiveness. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the creak of floorboards below. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Only the warmth of the quilt and the sound of rainwater dripping from the eaves. Then the ache of yesterday returned, slow and steady, but quieter now, as if softened by sleep. Eli Mercer was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. He moved with quiet precision, mending a fence post, his broad back turned toward her. The light caught the edges of his hair, and for a heartbeat, she saw him not as the man who'd lost a bride, but as someone simply surviving, like her. "I made breakfast," she said after a moment. He nodded, still hammering. "Appreciate it." That was how their days began, with short words and long silences that felt almost like peace. She cooked, cleaned, swept the dust from the corners. He worked the land, repaired what storms had broken. They passed one another like two spirits bound by work and weather, not yet by trust. Yet small gestures began to build a bridge where words could not. He left her an extra cup of coffee in the mornings. She mended his torn sleeve without asking. When a stray colt escaped from the paddock, they chased it together through the open field, her laughter ringing out for the first time since she'd arrived. He looked at her then, really looked, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, but the town did not stay quiet. Red Hollow was small, and whispers traveled faster than wind. At the general store, women spoke behind their hands. "That bride's living under his roof now," Martha Pike said. "Can't say what sort of woman rides into town a day late and stays for a widower's comfort." Clara heard them one morning as she passed. The shame burned in her chest like coals. That night she packed her few belongings, the letter, her gloves, the ribbon she used to tie her hair. When Eli came in from the barn, she was standing by the door. "I'll leave at dawn," she said softly. "It's not right for me to stay." He looked at her, quiet for a long while, then said, "Let them talk. You don't owe anyone your absence." Her throat tightened. "And what do I owe you, Mr. Mercer?" He set his hat down slowly. "Nothing," he said, "except maybe your own peace." Outside, thunder rolled over the valley. By nightfall, the storm had grown wild. Rain lashed against the windows. The wind howled through the eaves. Together they hauled sacks of grain from the barn, lightning turning the world white around them. A tree split and crashed near the fence, startling the horses. Eli ran to untangle them, shouting over the storm, and a falling branch struck his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. Clara ran to him, heart pounding. "Eli!" She dragged him inside, soaked to the bone, trembling from fear and cold. The lantern flickered as she tore her shawl into strips and bound his wound. He tried to speak, but pain silenced him. "Don't," she whispered. "Just rest." For hours she sat beside him, watching the storm claw at the windows. His breath came ragged, then steadied. Half-conscious, he murmured something, a soft, broken thing. She wouldn't have made it through this. "Maybe you were never late, Clara." Her hand tightened around his. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling onto his skin like confession. The storm raged, then slowly died. When dawn broke, the sky was washed pale and clean. She stepped outside barefoot, the mud cool beneath her feet. The grave by the cottonwood stood untouched, the sage she'd planted still upright, its silver leaves trembling in the wind. Behind her, Eli's voice came low and rough from the doorway. "You remind me this place can still hold kindness." She turned to him, smiling faintly. "And you remind me not everything lost was meant to be kept." They shared coffee on the porch, the sunlight turning the puddles gold. For a moment, silence felt like a promise instead of a wound. Weeks passed. The rhythm between them deepened, not as man and wife, not yet, but as two souls finding steady ground. Still, the world kept testing them. One morning at the general store, Clara stood in line when Martha Pike's voice sliced through the air. "You're living in sin on that man's land," she sneered. "You think pity will make you a wife?" Clara froze. The old shame rose again, hot and dizzying, until she heard boots behind her. Eli's voice was calm but carried like thunder. "She lives there because I asked her to," he said. "And if that offends your God, take it up with him." The room went still. Martha turned away. Clara felt her heart tremble, not with fear, but with something fierce. Pride. She walked beside Eli through the stairs and the silence, her chin lifted. That evening, as dusk poured through the windows, she found her old letter tucked inside her bag. The edges were worn, the words nearly gone. She read aloud softly, "I was afraid of dying alone, but I think I was more afraid of living unseen." Her voice cracked. Eli stood in the doorway, listening. When she looked up, he said quietly, "Then stay seen." With me, he didn't reach for her. He simply stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the warmth between them. His hand brushed hers, a slow, certain touch that said more than any vow. Days turned into weeks, and the air grew gentle again. Wildflowers climbed over the graveyard fence. Children from the town began to visit the ranch for lessons. Clara taught them letters beneath the cottonwood tree, while Eli repaired the barn roof nearby. One afternoon, a wagon rolled past the ranch road. The driver called out with a grin, "You're the bride who came too late, ain't you?" Clara smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "No," she said softly. "I came when I was meant to." The sun sank low over Red Hollow, turning the sage and sky to fire. And somewhere between the hum of crickets and the whisper of wind, time itself seemed to sigh, as if the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. Some journeys don't run by clocks or roads, but by mercy. We think we're too late until someone looks at us and says, "You're right on time for me." So if ever you feel the world has moved on without you, remember this little tale from Red Hollow. Sometimes being late is just heaven's way of making sure you arrive whole.